truck. There's no here. High value. Fine. Start by handing me
$1 million in 1 month.
and then you'll rob me. Dream of having a Mustang when I was a kid.
What makes this job different?
In Los Angeles, Mike carefully cleans himself up, methodically preparing for what's next. He retrieves his gun, slips into his car, and activates a tracking device to locate Mashud's vehicle. Once he locks onto the signal, he begins tailing him through the city streets. Spotting a tunnel ahead, Mike accelerates and positions his car in a way that blocks the path. Forced to stop behind him, Mashud has no choice but to step out. Mike quickly pulls on a mask, pops open his trunk, and waits. As Mashud approaches, confused, Mike raises his weapon and takes control of the situation. After checking him for anything dangerous, Mike orders him into the trunk. He demands the phone's passcode, making sure he has full access. Before shutting the trunk, he calmly mentions there's water inside, almost as if offering reassurance, then slams it shut. He then removes the tracking device he had secretly planted on Mashud's car months earlier, grabs the man's phone, and returns to his own vehicle, driving off without hesitation. At the same time, two cousins, Ben and Ali, prepare for a job of their own. Armed and focused, they enter a jewelry store where the owner, Sammy, greets them. He hands over a set of diamonds, neatly packed into a briefcase. But before they leave, Sammy pulls Ben aside into his office. Behind closed doors, Sammy reveals the truth. The diamonds in the briefcase are worthless replicas. The real stones, worth around $3 million, are to be hidden in Ben's socks for safety. It's a precaution in case anything goes wrong. Right then, Mike pulls up outside the shop. Using Mashud's phone, he sends Sammy a message indicating he's ready. Just before the cousins leave, Sammy asks to inspect their weapons. He's unimpressed with Ali's gun and swaps it out for something more reliable. Moments later, the cousins drive off, unaware that Mike is now following closely behind, posing as Mashud. Eventually, they pull into a parking lot. Mike follows and deliberately parks too close to them, bumping their side mirror. As they react, he steps out wearing his mask, gun already drawn. He holds up his phone, showing a live feed of Ben's house, an unmistakable threat. Under pressure, Mike orders them to drop both their weapons and their phones into his car. Once they comply, he steps out again, pointing his gun directly at Ben, calm but firm. He demands the real diamonds, making it clear he knows the briefcase is filled with fakes. Ben tries to play dumb at first, denying everything, but Mike raises the stakes by mentioning Ben's wife by name. That's enough to break him. Reluctantly, Ben hands over the real diamonds. Mike returns to his car and releases Mashud from the trunk, using the moment as a distraction. But that split second is all Ali needs. He secretly reaches for a second gun he had hidden. As Mike gets back into his vehicle, he tosses the phones back. Suddenly, Ali raises the weapon and fires, but his hands are shaking. The shot goes wide, shattering a window instead. Startled and terrified, Mike floors the accelerator and speeds away. He weaves through traffic recklessly, narrowly avoiding multiple crashes. At one point, he even slams into the back of another car, but doesn't stop. He keeps going until he finally reaches a parking lot. There, he pauses, just long enough to steady his breathing. He removes a contact lens, then quickly covers the car and switches to another vehicle, disappearing once again. Elsewhere, Sharon arrives at the luxurious home of Stephen, hoping to sell him an insurance policy. Stephen proudly shows off his advanced security system before suddenly pulling out a gun and leading her to a window. He challenges her to shoot a bottle outside. Clearly uncomfortable and inexperienced, Sharon takes the shot and misses completely. They later sit by the pool to go over policy details. During their conversation, Sharon notices a young woman walking nearby. Assuming she's Stephen's daughter, Sharon casually mentions her, only for Stephen to correct her. The woman is actually his fiancée. Sharon awkwardly tries to include her in the discussion, but the atmosphere becomes noticeably tense. Meanwhile, detectives Lou and Tillman arrive at the parking lot to investigate the robbery involving the cousins. They question Ben and Ali, both of whom seem uneasy. Lou quickly notes how suspicious it is that the robber had such detailed knowledge of their operation. Ben insists he has no idea who it could be. They spot a security camera nearby, but it's been disabled, cut cleanly before the incident. Afterward, Lou shares his theory with Tillman. He believes this is the same criminal he's been tracking for months. The pattern fits perfectly: no unnecessary violence, cameras disabled ahead of time, precise knowledge of valuable transfers, and a quick escape using Route 101. Tillman isn't convinced. He reveals that his superior has already suggested switching partners. Although he refused, he warns Lou that he needs to get himself together, or risk both of their careers falling apart. Back at home, Mike carefully hides the diamonds inside a cup. As he touches his head, he realizes he's been injured, likely from the shattered window earlier. Checking his mask, he finds a small blood stain. That raises a serious concern. He may have left traces behind in the abandoned car. Later that evening, Mike meets with a man known as Money, a black market dealer who specializes in reselling stolen goods. Mike admits he's uneasy about an upcoming job in Santa Barbara. The presence of civilians makes him nervous. He doesn't want anyone getting hurt. Money brushes it off, telling him to simply come up with a smarter plan. Before leaving, Mike casually swaps cups with him, a subtle move that doesn't go unnoticed. After Mike walks away, Money makes a discreet phone call. That night, Mike checks into a hotel and hires a woman to spend time with him. But his mind is elsewhere. He's distracted, restless. Eventually, he returns home and begins researching employees at an insurance company, his focus landing on Sharon's profile. The following day, the insurance company holds a meeting about the stolen diamonds. Sharon is assigned to coordinate with the police, a decision that frustrates her, especially when she learns that Stephen's case has been handed to someone else. At the police station, Tillman and Lou question Sammy. Offended by any suggestion of wrongdoing, Sammy insists he never discussed the diamonds with anyone. The only communication he had was through email, which leads to one conclusion. Someone must have hacked him. Elsewhere, sitting in a quiet diner, Mike meets with a hacker. He pays for detailed access: Sharon's social media, emails, calendar, even her private messages. Everything he needs to know about her life is now at his fingertips. Elsewhere, Orman speeds through the streets on his motorcycle, pushing it to the limit before finally pulling into a quiet parking lot. Waiting there is Money. Without wasting time, Money gets straight to the point. Mike has lost his edge. The Santa Barbara job is off for him. Instead, Money wants Orman to take over. That same night, Mike is driving calmly through the city when, out of nowhere, another car slams into the back of his vehicle. The driver, Maya, steps out, clearly frustrated, and asks for his insurance details. Mike, trying to avoid complications, offers her cash on the spot to settle the damage, but Maya isn't having it. Since the car belongs to her boss, she insists on handling things properly. Reluctantly, Mike agrees, and they exchange information. The next day, Sharon sits down with Lou to relay a message from the insurance company. They want polygraph tests conducted on Sammy and the two cousins. Lou immediately recognizes what's going on. The company is just trying to dodge the payout. He mocks their tactics without hesitation. Sharon fires back, criticizing the police for their own flaws. The tension escalates quickly into a heated argument. She points out that statistically, cases like this often turn out to be inside jobs. That statement sparks something in Lou's mind. Without another word, he walks away. Back at the station, Lou gathers his team. He pins up a large map displaying 219 robberies from the past 4 years. One by one, he eliminates cases that don't match a specific pattern, those involving less than $500,000, incidents without couriers or armored transport, any use of violence, or cases where evidence like DNA was left behind. What remains forms a clear trail along the 101 freeway. Lou lays out his theory. This thief is hacking into jewelers' communications, learning exactly when high-value items are being transported. Based on the pattern, he predicts the next hit will take place somewhere further north, but his presentation doesn't impress everyone. After the meeting, the lieutenant pulls Lou aside and tears into him. He points out that many of the cases Lou included already have suspects, and at least one has been officially closed. Reopening them would damage the department's clearance rate, a number they care about more than anything else. Lou's theory gets no backing. At the same time, Orman is already in position. He parks his bike near a bank and watches as a man carrying a briefcase steps into a car. Shortly after, that same man arrives at a jewelry store in Santa Barbara. Orman makes his move. He rushes the man, forcing him inside at gunpoint. When he tries to grab the briefcase, he realizes it's secured with handcuffs. Irritated, he orders everyone in the store to lie face down on the floor. He checks the back room, only to find a baby, nothing of value. Frustration builds. He strikes a woman with his gun, then turns back to the man, demanding the key. The man claims it's in his car. Orman glances outside. There's no car in sight. Furious, he starts beating the man until the truth comes out. The key is hanging around his neck. Once the cuffs are unlocked, Orman takes the briefcase and prepares to leave. But then greed kicks in. He notices more valuable pieces displayed in the store. Grabbing an employee by the hair, he forces her to open the cabinets. One by one, she empties the jewelry into his bag. When he's done, Orman orders everyone to pile on top of the first victim. He heads for the exit, but the door won't budge. It's locked. Realizing he needs to trigger a release button, he rushes back, but he's too slow. The door locks again. Growing impatient, he fires at one of the display cases to scare the staff into action. The alarm begins blaring as someone finally hits the button. This time, Orman bolts out before it locks again. Meanwhile, Mike reaches out to Maya, texting her to meet up. That evening, they sit down at an upscale restaurant. Mike presents himself as a traveling software developer, someone constantly on the move, but Maya feels out of place in such a setting. She admits it openly. Understanding her discomfort, Mike suggests they leave. He explains he only picked the place because it's considered ideal for dates. They end up grabbing street food instead. In that simpler setting, the conversation flows naturally. Despite their differences, they find common ground. By the end of the night, Maya agrees to see him again. But as soon as she leaves, Mike checks the news and sees coverage of the Santa Barbara robbery. He immediately knows something is off. Elsewhere, Lou sits across from his wife in a diner. The conversation quickly turns heavy as she confesses she's been unfaithful. His phone rings, Tillman calling, but Lou ignores it, focusing on the moment in front of him. His wife offers to move out, but Lou shuts it down. He says he'll be the one to leave instead. The argument intensifies, voices rising, until Lou finally walks away. Later, he arrives at the crime scene, joining his team inside the jewelry store. Tillman points out that the location matches Lou's earlier prediction, the north, but Lou shakes his head. Something feels different. This robbery was messy, violent. It doesn't match the clean, calculated style he's been tracking. This is someone else. At the same time, Mike confronts Money. He accuses him of using the information he gathered, then handing the job to someone else. To Mike, it feels like a betrayal. He warns Money clearly, if this happens again, their partnership is over. Money, angered, reminds Mike that without him, he'd be nothing. But Mike doesn't respond. He simply turns and walks away. Back at the insurance company, Sharon observes as Sammy undergoes the polygraph test. He's visibly insulted by the entire process, lashing out at both Sharon and the company, offended that his honesty is being questioned. Sometime later, Money meets with Orman again. This time, the plan is different. Mike is preparing for another job. Instead of interfering directly, Orman is instructed to follow him. Let Mike do all the work, then rob him afterward. In the afternoon, Orman watches from a distance as Mike meets with the hacker. The data he paid for has been hidden behind layers of encryption, stored on a deliberately obscure website. Mike receives instructions on how to access it. After Mike leaves, Orman checks his phone, revealing that he has already planted a tracker on Mike's car. Back at home, Mike carefully studies everything he's gathered about Sharon, her routines, her schedule, her habits. He memorizes her calendar. The following day, he tails her discreetly all the way to a restaurant. Just as Sharon is about to leave the restaurant, Mike steps in, pretending to be another customer. He casually strikes up a conversation, steering it toward cars, using it as an easy way to connect. Sharon engages, intrigued enough to keep the exchange going for a moment longer. Back at the police station, Lou and Tillman review footage from multiple robberies. Lou notices something consistent. The suspect always switches vehicles. That detail pushes him toward a new idea. Canvass nearby parking areas for abandoned or hidden cars. That evening, Maya arrives at Mike's place for their second date. As she looks around, something feels off. The apartment is almost empty. No personal belongings, no photos, nothing that hints at a past. When she asks about it, Mike shrugs it off, saying he's not close to his family. He adds that he grew up with very little, so he never developed the habit of holding onto things. Trying to lighten the mood, Maya puts on some music and pulls him in to dance. At first, he's hesitant, but soon enough, they're moving together. The atmosphere shifts, growing more intimate. One thing leads to another, and they end up wrapped in each other. Later, as Maya starts to get dressed, Mike gently persuades her to stay a little longer. The next night, Mike steps out onto his balcony for some air. That's when he notices something unusual, a distant light that shouldn't be there. It clicks instantly. Someone is watching him. He spots Orman in the distance, then sees him ride off on his bike. Without wasting a second, Mike rushes downstairs, tearing through his car, checking every corner until he finds what he feared, a tracker. He removes it immediately. Knowing he's compromised, Mike makes a call to secure a new place. The following morning, Orman takes a more aggressive approach. Disguised as a delivery man, he forces his way into the hacker's apartment. Once inside, he throws him around violently before pinning him down. Pressing a gun against his mouth, he demands answers about the work he's been doing for Mike. Meanwhile, Lou continues his search across multiple parking lots. After days of nothing, he finally spots something unusual, a car hidden under a cover. He inspects it and immediately notices broken glass inside. Soon, the forensics team arrives and begins processing the vehicle. Among the debris, they discover a small but crucial piece of evidence, a drop of blood. Later that day, Mike visits an art gallery, fully aware that Sharon will be there. He approaches her as if by chance, and she recognizes him from their earlier encounter. They start talking, eventually sharing a drink. As the conversation deepens, Sharon explains her job and mentions that it has made her skilled at reading people. Mike challenges her, asks her to read him. She studies him carefully before answering. She describes him as someone who keeps secrets, someone meticulous, almost obsessive. She notes that he has both time and money, but also senses that he didn't grow up with wealth. Her accuracy unsettles him. Mike quickly shifts the tone, admitting that their meeting isn't random. He begins revealing things about her, details he shouldn't know. He mentions her long tenure at the same company, 11 years without a promotion. Then he tells her the truth. He works with people who provide inside information, using it to plan heists. He insists he operates with strict rules, no one gets hurt, and nothing is left behind to trace back to him. Sharon is clearly disturbed. She argues that stealing isn't the answer, that people should earn what they have. Mike counters, pointing out that the powerful figures behind her company aren't exactly innocent either. The tension builds. Sharon decides to leave. Before she goes, Mike gives her a strange condition. If she changes her mind, she should post a picture of the beach on Instagram. After she walks away, Mike notices something alarming. Orman is nearby, watching. Instantly, Mike rushes to his car and takes off after him. What follows is a high-speed pursuit through the city. Both men drive recklessly, cutting through traffic, taking sharp turns that put everyone around them at risk. At one point, a bus blocks Mike's path, forcing him to slow down. But when it clears, Orman is still there. They lock eyes for a split second before the chase resumes. Orman uses every trick he can think of to stay ahead, weaving through cars and creating chaos behind him. At one moment, he causes a collision, but Mike reacts quickly, narrowly avoiding the wreck. The chase intensifies as they enter a crowded street, making it harder to keep up. Then, in a moment of distraction, Orman glances back and crashes. He's thrown from his bike. Mike sees him get up and walk away as if nothing happened. He follows him into a nearby store, where Orman casually grabs a drink, pretending everything is normal. Mike isn't fooled. He storms in, grabs Orman, and slams him against a refrigerator, demanding answers. Even when Orman bites his hand, Mike doesn't let go. He pulls out his gun, making it clear he's not playing around. Under pressure, Orman finally admits the truth: money sent him. Mike leans in, cold and direct. If he ever sees them again, it won't end well. The next day, Sharon is surprised to find Lou attending her yoga class. They exchange a few words, the atmosphere calm for once, until Lou gets a call. There's been suspicious activity near a jewelry store. Lou rushes to the scene. As he arrives, he sees another detective take down a fleeing suspect. The man pulls off the mask, revealing not a seasoned criminal, but a teenager. Something feels off. As Lou observes, the other detective checks the boy and claims he was armed. Lou looks again and notices a gun in the boy's hand, but he's certain it wasn't there moments ago. Back at the station, Lou reports what he witnessed. The lieutenant isn't interested in hearing it. He's focused on protecting his officers. He even reveals that Tillman has agreed to support their version of events. As a result, all three detectives are suspended pending investigation. While clearing out his desk, Lou receives the forensic report from the abandoned car. The DNA has a match. The suspect's real name is James, Mike. The file reveals a troubled past, foster care, a long juvenile record, a history that explains more than it excuses. At the insurance company, Sharon faces her own disappointment. Another colleague has closed the deal with Steven, taking the credit. After the meeting, her boss delivers the news: no promotion this year, maybe next time. Sharon finally snaps. She confronts her boss, calling him out for feeding her the same empty promises year after year. She threatens to walk away and take her clients with her. Instead of backing down, her boss mocks her, bluntly saying wealthy clients won't follow someone her age. Furious and humiliated, Sharon storms out. She heads straight to the beach, standing there for a moment before pulling out her phone and taking a picture. She uploads it to Instagram. Within seconds, Mike gets the notification. He drops everything and rushes to meet her. When they sit down together, Sharon doesn't waste time. She lays out the opportunity. A courier is delivering luxury watches and high-end jewelry as wedding gifts for Steven. Since Steven deals strictly in cash, there will also be a significant amount of money on site. Altogether, she estimates the total could reach around $1 million. She wants in, and she wants a three-way split. Mike listens carefully, but he's cautious. The job is bigger, riskier than what he usually handles. Too many variables, too many people involved. He tells her he needs time to think. That night, Lou tracks down the last known address linked to Mike's past. There, he meets Anne. She's confused. She doesn't understand why anyone would be looking for James anymore. Soon after, Mike receives a voicemail from her, asking him to call back. He does. Anne tells him a police officer has come looking for him. When she hands the phone to Lou, Mike immediately hangs up. The next day, Mike approaches Sharon unexpectedly while she's sitting in her car. This time, his answer is clear. He's in. He hands her a disposable phone and gives strict instructions. After every call, destroy the SIM card. No traces. The plan begins to take shape. The following day, Mike visits the hotel where the wedding will take place, quietly observing the layout, security, and staff routines. At the same time, Sharon digs into the company system, pulling every detail she can about Steven's wedding. Later that evening, Sharon destroys the SIM card as instructed and takes out the trash. But when she returns to her apartment, she's ambushed. Orman is waiting. He knocks her to the ground and hits her repeatedly, demanding answers. His tone is cold and threatening. If she doesn't tell him everything about Mike, things will get much worse. The next day, Sharon skips her yoga session, but stays nearby until it ends. She approaches Lou afterward, revealing bruises on her body. They move to a quiet corner of the parking lot. There, she tells him everything. She admits she gave Orman the information too. She had no choice. Lou listens carefully. He can't guarantee she'll stay out of trouble, but he offers her protection. He tells her to stay at his place for now. Meanwhile, Orman heads to the hotel, blending in as he begins tracking one of the employees. Lou returns to the station and reviews evidence from the earlier diamond case. Among the items, he finds the bag containing the fake stones. At the same time, Mike meets Maya for dinner. He tells her he'll be leaving town for work, but asks her to wait for him. Maya doesn't buy it. She vents her frustration, pointing out how little she actually knows about him. To her, everything feels distant, unclear. Mike takes offense, interpreting her words as judgment. He argues that people who grow up with comfort will never understand what it means to survive when you have nothing, but it's not enough. Maya walks away. The next day, Sharon returns to work, but her focus is elsewhere. She constantly checks her phone, tracking the courier's flight. At one point, she overhears a coworker laughing at their boss's jokes. That's the breaking point. She storms into the office and unleashes everything she's been holding back. She calls out the lies, the manipulation, the favoritism. She accuses the company of valuing youth over experience, of using younger employees to impress wealthy clients. She even insults her boss directly. Then she walks out, this time for good. At the same moment, Mike waits near the airport. When he spots the security guard assigned to the delivery, he approaches him, weapon drawn. On his phone, he shows a live feed of the man's home, making it clear he's serious. He takes the guard's car and phone, assuming his identity. Soon after, the courier's plane lands. An urgent message redirects the courier straight into Mike's hands, but Mike doesn't realize something crucial. Lou has already stepped in, replacing the real courier. As they drive together, the tension is unmistakable. They exchange small talk, but both are on edge, watching each other carefully. Meanwhile, Orman infiltrates the hotel, wearing an employee uniform. He takes on a room service task, using it as his entry point to the wedding suite. When Mike and Lou arrive, they head directly to Steven. The moment the door closes, Mike pulls out his gun and orders everyone to the floor. Steven refuses to cooperate, but his fiancée, terrified, reveals the location of the cash. Mike forces Steven to open the safe and empties it into his bag. Then he tells Lou to open the case containing the jewelry. Lou complies, but instead of jewels, he pulls out the gun he had hidden earlier. He points it at Mike and reveals who he really is, a standoff. Before either of them can act, the situation explodes. Orman bursts into the room. He grabs Mike, disarms him, and points his own weapon at Lou. Now all three are locked in a chaotic standoff. Voices rise. No one is in control. Then suddenly, Orman fires. Steven drops to the ground. Orman demands the suitcase, but panic begins to creep in. A cop has seen his face. He knows things are spiraling. The argument intensifies, and then, without warning, Orman collapses. Mike has shot him with the weapon he took from Lou. Silence follows. Lou checks Orman, he's gone. Then Lou makes a decision. He pushes Mike's gun aside and tells him to leave. Get out of the city. Don't come back. He promises to pin everything on Orman. Mike hesitates, then drops his weapon and walks out. Behind him, Steven, injured but alive, lashes out at Lou for letting a criminal escape. Lou shuts him down immediately, threatening to expose his financial crimes and illegal dealings if he doesn't cooperate. Steven's fiancée pressures him as well. Reluctantly, he agrees. Outside, police cars surround the hotel, but Mike is already gone. Later, on a bus, Lou reveals something unexpected. He took the real diamonds, leaving the fake ones behind. He goes to the yoga studio and hands them over to Sharon, giving her a chance to start fresh. In return, she shows him a message Mike left, a photo, along with a note meant for Lou. Meanwhile, Mike drives away from the city, leaving everything behind. Later, Lou follows the location from the photo. There he finds Mike's vintage car waiting. The keys are inside. He gets in. Elsewhere, Maya receives an envelope. Inside is a photograph from Mike's childhood. On the back, there's a handwritten message, an apology, and a hope that maybe, someday, they'll find their way back to each other. Crime 101 is one of those films that almost feels designed to split a room in half. On one side, you have viewers who are going to walk out of this movie saying, that was exactly my kind of crime thriller. They'll point to the atmosphere, the patience, the cast, the confidence. They'll talk about how refreshing it is to watch a film that doesn't scream for attention every 5 minutes. A movie that actually wants to sit in its tension. A movie that trusts mood, character, and quiet control more than non-stop chaos. But on the other side, there are going to be plenty of people who come away frustrated, not because the film is incompetent, not because it's ugly, not because the actors aren't trying, but because for them, Crime 101 feels like a movie that keeps promising greatness without ever fully delivering it. A film with all the right ingredients, all the right influences, all the right visual signals, and yet somehow never becoming as gripping, memorable, or emotionally satisfying as it thinks it is. And honestly, that divided reaction makes perfect sense. Because this is not the kind of crime film that tries to win everybody over. It's measured, it's cool, it's restrained, it takes its time. It leans into long silences, careful conversations, and a steady, slow-burn rhythm instead of constant action. For some people, that makes it feel mature and cinematic. For others, it makes the film feel overlong, distant, and frustratingly self-serious. That's really the story of Crime 101 in a nutshell, admiration and disappointment existing at the same time. Because even if you don't love it, you can usually see what it's aiming for. This is clearly a film that wants to be taken seriously. It wants to live in that world of polished adult crime thrillers where the tension comes from professionalism, moral ambiguity, and the feeling that everybody in the story is carrying some private burden. It wants to be sleek. It wants to be smart. It wants to feel like the kind of movie people compare to the greats. And that ambition is part of what makes the reaction so mixed. When a film aims that high, people don't judge it gently. They judge it against what it could have been. And Crime 101 absolutely feels like a movie that could have been something really special. That's why the praise is strong, but the disappointment is strong too. People aren't reacting to something disposable here. They're reacting to a movie that gets close enough to greatness to make its flaws stand out even more. For some viewers, the experience is smooth, stylish, and consistently engaging. They'll say it's classy, well-acted, tense, and exactly the kind of grown-up thriller Hollywood doesn't make enough anymore. They'll enjoy the ride, accept the pace, and get pulled in by the tone alone. For others, the exact same qualities will register completely differently. The slow burn becomes drag, the mood becomes emptiness, the restraint becomes lack of payoff, the seriousness starts to feel a little too calculated. And instead of walking away impressed, they walk away thinking they just watched a very polished film that never found its pulse. That's what makes Crime 101 such an interesting movie to talk about. It's not a disaster, it's not a masterpiece, it's not the kind of film that creates one simple response. It's the kind of movie people respect, argue over, admire in parts, and resist in others. Some will call it one of the better crime thrillers they've seen in a while. Some will say it's a handsome imitation of better films. Some will love the confidence. Some will wish it had more urgency, more originality, or more emotional force. And maybe that's the most honest overall impression you can have. Crime 1001 is a good film that keeps flirting with being a great one. It has the cast, it has the look, it has the tone, it has the ambition. What it doesn't always have is full control over how all those strengths come together. So what you're left with is a movie that's undeniably impressive in certain ways, undeniably frustrating in others, and almost guaranteed to divide audiences depending on what they want from a crime thriller. In other words, Crime 101 is not a film people will react to casually. They'll either get caught up in its cool, controlled energy or spend the entire runtime waiting for it to become more than the image it projects. And that tension between admiration and dissatisfaction is exactly what makes its reception so divided. At its core, Crime 101 is built on one of the oldest, most compelling frameworks in crime storytelling, the hunter and the hunted. But what makes this setup interesting isn't just who is chasing whom, it's how they move through the world while doing it. On one side, you have a meticulous, high-end thief, not loud, not reckless, not driven by chaos, but by control. This is someone who treats crime like a profession. Every move is calculated, every job is clean, every risk is minimized. He's not trying to dominate the world. He's trying to outsmart it, quietly, precisely, and on his own terms. And now, he's circling what feels like his final score, one last move that could let him step away from everything. On the other side, you have a detective who doesn't rely on luck or spectacle. He's persistent, observant, the kind of cop who notices patterns others ignore, and once he locks onto something, he doesn't let go. But this isn't a clean, heroic figure either. His personal life is slipping, his world is narrowing, and his obsession with the case is starting to define him more than anything else. And between these two forces, the film builds its tension. Because this isn't just a chase, it's a slow collision. What Crime 101 does is expand that central dynamic by surrounding both men with lives that complicate everything. The thief begins to step outside his carefully controlled routine, forming connections, taking emotional risks, allowing people into a world that was once strictly professional. The detective, meanwhile, is dealing with the fallout of a life that's starting to crack under pressure, and then you introduce others into the equation. People with their own ambitions, frustrations, and breaking points. And suddenly, this isn't just a one-on-one game anymore. It becomes a network. Intersecting lives, overlapping motives, everyone moving toward the same event from different directions. That's where the film finds its identity. Because instead of building tension through constant action, it builds it through proximity. Through the feeling that all these characters are slowly drifting closer to the same moment. A heist, a confrontation, a decision that will define all of them. You're not watching explosions, you're watching inevitability. And that's what gives the story its quiet pull. The thief isn't just planning a job, he's trying to exit a life that's starting to unravel. The detective isn't just solving a case, he's chasing something that might be the last thing giving his life structure. The people around them aren't just side characters, they're pressure points. Emotional variables that can either stabilize the situation or blow it apart completely. So when the film leans into this cat-and-mouse structure, it's not about speed, it's about tension through control. It's about watching two professionals who understand the rules, slowly drift toward a moment where those rules stop protecting them. And the question becomes, who breaks first? Not through violence, not through spectacle, but through the cracks in their own lives. That's the real game Crime 101 is playing. It's not just thief versus cop. It's control versus collapse, precision versus pressure. And two men who might be more similar than they realize, heading toward the same inevitable point where something has to give. What really defines Crime 101, more than its action, more than its heists, is how it tells its story. This isn't a straight line from point A to point B, it's a web. A carefully constructed network of lives that keep crossing, overlapping, and quietly influencing each other until everything starts tightening toward the same moment. The film doesn't follow just one perspective. It moves between characters, the thief, the detective, the broker, the wild card, the relationships orbiting all of them, and instead of rushing through those transitions, it lets each thread breathe. You're not just watching events unfold, you're watching how different people experience the same world from completely different angles. And that's where the structure becomes interesting. Because every character isn't just part of the plot, they're carrying their own story, their own problems, their own internal conflicts. You've got loneliness, career frustration, instability, ambition, relationships that are either forming or falling apart, and all of that exists alongside the central heist narrative. So instead of one storyline driving everything forward, you get multiple currents flowing at the same time. Sometimes they run parallel, sometimes they collide, and sometimes they quietly influence each other in ways you don't immediately notice. That's what gives the film its sense of depth. There's a rhythm to how it moves, shifting from one character to another, letting tension build in one thread before cutting to another, then circling back with new context. When it works, it creates this feeling that everything is connected, even when the characters themselves don't fully realize it yet. You're watching a system where every decision, personal or professional, has consequences that ripple outward. But here's where the structure becomes a double-edged sword. Because while this interconnected approach adds complexity, it also adds weight. The more threads you introduce, the more carefully they need to be developed, and that's where Crime 101 starts to strain at times. Some storylines feel rich and engaging. Others feel underexplored. There are moments where characters are introduced, given just enough presence to suggest importance, and then fade into the background without a meaningful payoff. Certain relationships are built up, only to feel like they don't fully deliver on what they promise. And as the film continues layering subplot over subplot, you can feel the narrative stretching itself, trying to balance everything without always succeeding. It's not confusion. You always understand what's happening, but it can feel crowded, like the film is juggling more than it can fully handle. And that impacts the pacing too, because when you're constantly shifting between multiple threads, the momentum can start to fragment. Just as one storyline begins to build tension, the film cuts away to another. Sometimes that enhances the suspense, other times it disrupts it, so you get this push and pull throughout the movie. Moments where the structure feels smart, layered, and immersive, followed by moments where it feels like the film is circling instead of advancing. But when everything aligns, when the threads start converging, when the characters' paths finally intersect in meaningful ways, that's when Crime 101 feels the most alive. Because suddenly, all those separate storylines stop feeling like separate pieces. They become one collision course. And that's the promise of this structure. Not just multiple stories, but multiple lives, all heading toward the same point, whether they realize it or not. And when that convergence hits, even briefly, you can see exactly what the film was aiming for all along. If there's one thing Crime 101 keeps circling back to, it's this idea that nobody in this story is completely clean. And nobody is completely lost either. These aren't heroes and villains in the traditional sense, they're people. People with codes, pressures, histories, and just enough justification to convince themselves that what they're doing makes sense. And that's where the film finds its moral tension. Because the thief at the center isn't presented as reckless or cruel. He operates with discipline, with restraint, with a kind of professional code that separates him, at least in his own mind, from the chaos of the world around him. He doesn't see himself as destructive. He sees himself as controlled, calculated, almost principled. But that self-image starts to crack. As the story unfolds, he begins to step outside his own rules. He forms connections. He lets emotion bleed into decisions that were once purely strategic. And suddenly, the line between professional and personal starts to blur. The more human he becomes, the less predictable he is, and the more dangerous his world becomes, not just for others, but for himself. Then you have the detective. On paper, he's the law, the one chasing order, the one trying to stop all of this. But the film doesn't treat him as morally pure either. He's obsessive, isolated, his personal life is unraveling, and his sense of identity is tied almost entirely to the chase. He's not just pursuing justice, he's pursuing something he needs. And that obsession starts to mirror the very behavior he's trying to stop. So what you get is this fascinating duality. Two men on opposite sides of the law, slowly becoming reflections of each other, both driven, both isolated, both defined by the systems they operate in, and both starting to bend under pressure. But the film doesn't stop there, because the most interesting layer comes from the people caught in between. Halle Berry's character, for example, represents something completely different. She's not part of the crime world in the same way. She's navigating a professional environment where she's overlooked, undervalued, and quietly pushed aside. Her frustration doesn't explode, it simmers. And when an opportunity appears, it's not just about money, it's about recognition, agency, and taking control of a life that feels like it's slipping past her. That's what makes her decisions compelling. They're not driven by greed alone, they're driven by everything she's been denied. Then you introduce someone like the wild card, unpredictable, reckless, operating without the same code as the others. Where the thief is controlled and the detective is methodical, this character is pure instability. And that contrast matters, because it highlights just how fragile the illusion of control really is. Because in a world like this, all it takes is one unpredictable force to throw everything off balance. And suddenly, the entire system starts to shake. That's the beauty of the character dynamics in Crime 1001. It's not about good versus evil. It's about different kinds of justification, different ways people rationalize their choices, different breaking points. You start to understand why the thief does what he does. You understand why the detective can't let go. You understand why someone on the outside might choose to step into that world. And that understanding is what creates the tension. Because the more you see their motivations, the harder it becomes to fully root for or against anyone. The lines blur. Loyalties shift. And at a certain point, you're not watching a story about crime anymore. You're watching a story about people trying to maintain control over their lives, and slowly realizing that control was never as solid as they thought. That's the moral ambiguity Crime 101 leans into. Not to excuse the choices these characters make, but to show how easy it is to justify them when you're the one making them. At the center of Crime 1001 is a character who doesn't fit the typical mold of a cinematic criminal. This isn't a loud, charismatic mastermind. This isn't a reckless outlaw chasing adrenaline. This is a man built on control. From the very beginning, the thief is defined by precision. He plans carefully, he moves quietly, he avoids unnecessary risks. There's a discipline to the way he operates, almost like he's following a personal code that separates him from the chaos of the world he exists in. He doesn't want attention, he doesn't want noise, he wants efficiency, and that's what makes him interesting. Because on the surface, he's someone who has everything under control. But underneath that, you start to feel the cracks. There's a distance to him, a kind of isolation that doesn't come from circumstance, but from choice. His life is structured in a way that keeps people out, emotionally, socially, even psychologically. He's built a system that allows him to function without needing anyone else, and for a while, that system works, until it doesn't. Because the moment he starts letting people in, whether it's through relationships, emotional attachments, or even small moments of vulnerability, that carefully constructed identity begins to shift. The same man who once operated like a machine starts making decisions that feel different, less precise, less predictable. And that's where the characterization becomes divisive. For some, this evolution feels human. It shows that no matter how controlled someone appears, they're still capable of change, of slipping, of wanting something more than just the job. It adds a layer of fragility to a character who initially seems untouchable. But for others, that shift doesn't feel earned, because the film doesn't always give enough space for that transformation to fully develop. One moment, he's the perfect operator. The next, he's making choices that seem to contradict everything we've been told about him. And instead of feeling like a natural progression, it can feel abrupt, like a character turning before we've seen why. That tension sits at the heart of his role, because this is a character caught between two identities, the professional and the person, the man who follows rules and the man who wants something beyond them. And the more those two sides collide, the more unstable he becomes. There's also an interesting layer in how he presents himself. He's not socially smooth. He's not effortlessly charming in every situation. In fact, there are moments where he feels awkward, almost disconnected when dealing with people outside his controlled environment. That contrast between the confident operator during a job and the uncertain individual in personal interactions adds depth to the character. It suggests that his control only exists within a specific context. Outside of it, he's just as vulnerable as anyone else. But even with that complexity, the performance itself becomes part of the conversation. There are moments where the character feels grounded, believable, even compelling. And then there are moments where you're reminded of the actor behind him, where the illusion slips, and instead of fully seeing the character, you see the presence of a star trying to disappear into a role. That push and pull never fully settles. And maybe that's why the character leaves such a mixed impression. Because he's not written as a traditional anti-hero you instantly connect with. He's more reserved, more internal, more distant. The film asks you to observe him, to understand him, rather than immediately invest in him emotionally. For some viewers, that makes him intriguing. For others, it makes him hard to fully engage with. But regardless of where you land, one thing is clear. This isn't a character defined by action. He's defined by tension. The tension between who he is and who he's becoming. The tension between control and the slow, inevitable loss of it. And as that tension builds, you realize that the real question isn't whether he'll pull off the job. It's whether he can hold on to the version of himself he built, or if that identity is already slipping away. If the thief in Crime 101 represents control, then the detective represents obsession. And the brilliance of the film, at least in concept, is how it positions these two men not as opposites, but as reflections. Because on paper, the detective is everything the thief isn't. He's the law. He's the one chasing order, chasing truth, chasing justice. He's supposed to be the moral center of the story, but the film doesn't treat him like a clean hero. It treats him like a man who's been doing this too long. From the moment we meet him, there's a weariness there, a sense that this job has taken more than it's given back. His personal life is fractured. His relationships are strained. And the deeper he gets into the case, the more everything else starts to fade into the background. Because this isn't just a job for him. It's something he needs. He notices patterns others miss. He trusts his instincts even when there's no hard proof. And once he locks onto the idea that these crimes are connected, he doesn't let go. Not because he has to, but because he can't. And that's where the duality begins to emerge. Because if you look closely, the detective and the thief aren't that different. Both are defined by routine. Both operate within a system they understand better than anyone else. Both isolate themselves from the world in order to stay effective. And both are starting to crack under the weight of their own choices. The thief controls his environment through precision. The detective tries to control his through persistence, but in both cases, that control is fragile. And the more the story unfolds, the more their paths begin to mirror each other. The thief starts making emotional decisions, breaking his own rules. The detective starts bending his own boundaries, letting instinct override everything else. So what you end up watching isn't just a chase. It's a convergence. Two men moving toward each other, not just physically, but psychologically, each one representing a different side of the same coin. That's what gives the film its most interesting tension. Because you're not just asking, will the detective catch him? You're asking, what happens when they finally meet? What happens when the man who lives outside the law and the man who enforces it realize how similar they actually are? And that's where the film leans into something more subtle. It blurs the line between right and wrong, because the detective isn't purely righteous. He's driven, he's obsessive. At times, he's just as consumed as the man he's chasing. And the thief isn't purely corrupt. He operates with a code. He avoids unnecessary harm. He believes, whether he's right or not, that he's different from the chaos around him. So the closer they get, the harder it becomes to separate them. That's the duality Crime 101 is built on. Not hero versus villain, but two professionals, both excellent at what they do, both slowly losing control in different ways. And when those two forces finally collide, it's not just about who wins, it's about what's left of them when the chase is over. Because in a story like this, catching the other person might not be the real cost. Becoming them might be. In a film filled with professionals, thieves, detectives, operators, Halle Berry's character stands apart. Because she doesn't enter the story as part of the game, she's pulled into it. And that difference is what gives her role its weight. At first glance, she exists on the edge of the central conflict, an insurance broker navigating a world that's quietly pushing her aside. She's experienced, capable, and proven, but she's also overlooked. Surrounded by younger faces, dismissed by superiors, treated like she's already had her moment. There's a frustration simmering beneath the surface of every interaction she has. And the film doesn't shout that frustration, it lets it build. You see it in the way she carries herself, in the way she responds, or doesn't respond, to the people around her, in the subtle tension between who she knows she is and how the world is choosing to see her. That's where her character becomes more than just part of the plot. She becomes the film's connection to something real. Because while the thief and the detective are operating inside systems they understand, she's stuck in one that's actively working against her. Her struggle isn't about pulling off a job or solving a case. It's about relevance, respect, control over her own life. And when opportunity enters that space, it doesn't feel like temptation. It feels like a release. That's what makes her involvement so compelling. It's not driven purely by greed. It's driven by everything she's been denied, every missed promotion, every dismissive interaction, every moment where her experience counted for less than someone else's perception. So when she steps closer to the world of crime, it doesn't feel like a sudden shift. It feels like a response, a decision shaped by years of pressure finally reaching a breaking point. And that's where her thematic importance really comes into focus, because she represents something the other characters don't: the cost of being overlooked, the quiet erosion of identity in a system that values image over substance, the idea that sometimes people don't turn toward risky choices because they want to, but because they feel like they have no other way to reclaim control. At the same time, her presence changes the dynamic of the entire story. She's not just another piece on the board, she's a disruption. Her connection to the thief complicates his carefully controlled world. Her decisions introduce emotional stakes into a system that was built on precision. And her perspective adds a layer of humanity to a narrative that could easily become cold and mechanical. She forces the story to slow down, to feel, and that's where the performance comes in. Halle Berry brings a sense of lived experience to the role, not through big, dramatic moments, but through restraint, through the way she holds tension, through the way she allows frustration, dignity, and vulnerability to exist at the same time. There are scenes where she doesn't need to say much. You understand exactly what her character is carrying just by watching her. That kind of presence matters in a film like this. Because without her, the story risks becoming too focused on systems and strategy. With her, it becomes personal. But like much of Crime 1001, her role is also part of the film's inconsistency. There are moments where she feels essential, deeply connected to the emotional core of the story. And then there are moments where it feels like the film doesn't fully follow through on what it sets up for her. Certain developments hint at something bigger, something more impactful, but don't always deliver the payoff that those setups promise. And that's frustrating, because you can see the potential. You can see the version of this character that could have anchored the entire film, not just as a participant in the plot, but as the emotional lens through which everything is understood. Still, even within those limitations, she leaves a mark. Because she's not just part of the crime, she's part of the reason it matters. She represents the world outside the game, and what happens when that world gets pulled into it. And in a story about control, power, and professional identity, she's the one character who reminds you what's at stake when those things start to slip. Every controlled system needs one thing to truly test it: chaos. And in Crime 1001, that chaos comes in the form of Barry Keoghan's character, a presence that doesn't just enter the story, it disrupts it. Because while everyone else in this film operates with rules, codes, discipline, patience, Keoghan's character feels like he exists outside of all of that. He's unpredictable, unstable. The kind of person who doesn't follow the rhythm of the world around him, he breaks it. And the moment he shows up, you feel that shift. The tone tightens, the control starts slipping. Because now, the game isn't just about precision anymore, it's about volatility. What makes his role so effective is the contrast he creates. The thief is calculated, the detective is methodical, even the supporting players move with intention. But Keoghan's character, he's impulsive, reckless. He doesn't wait for the perfect moment. He forces it. And that makes him dangerous in a way no one else in the film is. Not because he's the smartest, but because he's the least predictable. You can't plan around someone like that. You can't control them. And that's exactly why he works. He becomes the wrench in the machine, the element that exposes just how fragile everyone else's control really is. Because no matter how perfect your plan is, it only works if everyone plays by the same rules. And he doesn't. That unpredictability gives the film some of its most memorable moments. There's an edge to every scene he's in, a feeling that something could go wrong at any second. You're not watching strategy anymore, you're watching tension built on instability, and that energy is contagious. Even in scenes where not much is happening on the surface, his presence alone creates unease. It's not about what he's doing, it's about what he might do. That sense of potential chaos lingers, and it keeps you on edge in a way the more controlled characters don't. That's the power of a wild card. He doesn't just exist within the story, he changes how the story feels. And then there's the performance itself. Barry Keoghan leans fully into that unpredictability. There's something off balance about the way he carries himself. In his expressions, his timing, his stillness. He doesn't play the character as loud or exaggerated. Instead, he keeps it just grounded enough to feel real, but just unhinged enough to feel dangerous. It's that balance that makes him a scene stealer, because even in a film filled with strong performances, he's the one you keep watching, the one who lingers in your mind after the scene ends, the one who brings an entirely different energy into a movie that otherwise thrives on control. But like many elements in Crime 1001, his role also highlights a limitation. Because while he's incredibly effective in the moment, there's a sense that the film doesn't fully capitalize on what he brings. His character is introduced as a major disruptive force, and while he delivers on that promise in individual scenes, the overall arc doesn't always feel as fully realized as it could have been. You're left wanting more depth, more impact, more consequence. And that's both a compliment and a critique, because when a character leaves you wanting more, it means they worked. It means they mattered. And in a story built on control, precision, and carefully calculated moves, Barry Keoghan's wildcard presence is the reminder that all it takes is one unpredictable force to bring everything crashing down. Not through strength, not through strategy, but through pure, uncontainable chaos. If there's one area where Crime 101 almost everyone can agree, it's the cast. Because no matter where you land on the story, the pacing, or the ending, this ensemble is doing a lot of heavy lifting, and you can feel it. This is one of those films where the performances are constantly working to elevate the material. Even in scenes where the writing starts to thin out, the actors keep things grounded, believable, and watchable. There's a level of commitment across the board that gives the film weight, even when the narrative doesn't always support it. At the center, Chris Hemsworth delivers a performance that's clearly trying to break away from expectation. He dials things down, plays it quieter, more internal. There's a restraint to his performance that fits the character's controlled nature. And while that approach doesn't fully land for everyone, sometimes you still see the star instead of the man. There are moments where it works, where that subtlety adds a different texture than what audiences might expect from him. Then you have Mark Ruffalo, who brings a completely different kind of presence. There's a grounded, lived-in quality to his performance. He doesn't feel like he's performing, he feels like he's existing. His detective carries fatigue, instinct, and quiet intensity without ever pushing too hard. Even when the character leans into familiar territory, Ruffalo gives it enough nuance to keep it engaging. He anchors the film in a way that makes everything around him feel more real. Halle Berry adds another layer entirely. Her performance carries emotional weight, not through big, dramatic gestures, but through control. You feel her frustration, her dignity, her sense of being overlooked, all without the film needing to spell it out. There's a maturity to her role that stands out, and in several key moments, she becomes one of the film's strongest emotional anchors. And then there's Barry Keoghan, who almost plays in a different movie, in the best way possible. He brings unpredictability, energy, a kind of off-balance presence that cuts through the film's controlled tone. Every time he's on screen, the dynamic shifts. He's not just part of the ensemble, he's the element that keeps it from becoming too restrained, too composed. And because of that, he ends up stealing more than a few scenes. Beyond the main players, the supporting cast fills out the world effectively. Even in smaller roles, there's a sense that each character belongs in this space, that they have a purpose, even if the script doesn't always give them enough room to fully develop it. And that's where the performances become even more important. Because while the writing sometimes struggles with depth, consistency, or follow-through, the actors keep pushing through those limitations. They bring credibility to moments that might otherwise feel thin. They create tension in scenes that rely more on presence than action. They make you care, or at least stay engaged, even when the story starts to lose momentum. But at the same time, the strength of the ensemble also highlights what the film is missing, because you can't help but feel like this cast was capable of even more. There are moments where characters feel underwritten, moments where relationships don't fully develop, moments where arcs hint at something deeper but never quite reach it. And when you have actors of this caliber, those gaps become more noticeable, because you can see the potential that's just out of reach. Still, despite those limitations, the ensemble remains one of the film's greatest assets. They give Crime 101 its texture. They give it its credibility. They give it its emotional weight. And in many ways, they're the reason the film works as well as it does. Because even when everything else feels slightly off, the performances keep pulling you back in. If there's one thing Crime 101 never lacks, it's confidence. From the very first frame, you can feel the director's hand guiding everything. This is not a messy film. It's not chaotic. It's not unsure of itself. Every scene, every transition, every tonal choice feels deliberate, like the filmmaker knows exactly what kind of movie he wants to make, and that kind of control is impressive. Because Crime 101 is not an easy film to direct. It's built on restraint. It relies on silence, tension, character interactions, and atmosphere more than spectacle. There are long stretches where nothing big happens on the surface, no explosions, no constant action, and yet the film still has to hold your attention. That requires discipline. And for the most part, the direction delivers that. The film moves with a steady, composed rhythm. It doesn't rush, it doesn't panic, it allows scenes to unfold naturally, trusting the performances and the environment to carry the weight. There's a sense that the filmmaker is intentionally holding back, saving moments, building pressure, letting the audience sit in the quiet before something shifts. When it works, it feels controlled in the best way. Like a director who understands that tension doesn't come from noise, it comes from anticipation. You see that, especially in how the film handles suspense. Instead of overwhelming you, it builds slowly. Scenes are constructed around proximity, silence, and timing. The camera lingers just long enough. The pacing stretches just enough. The atmosphere thickens just enough. And when the film finally releases that tension, whether through a confrontation or a burst of action, it feels earned. That's not accidental. That's direction. There's also a strong sense of visual intention. The way scenes are framed, the way the camera moves, the way the city is presented, it all feels cohesive. Nothing looks random. Nothing feels thrown together. The film has a clear identity, and the direction is what holds that identity in place. Even the transitions between storylines show that control. The film shifts from one character to another smoothly, maintaining a consistent tone while juggling multiple threads. That's not easy to pull off, especially in a story with intersecting narratives, but the direction keeps it from becoming confusing or disjointed, at least on the surface. Because here's where that same control starts to become a limitation. The film is so committed to its tone, so focused on being measured, restrained, and deliberate, that it sometimes forgets to evolve. Scenes linger longer than they need to. Moments that should escalate stay at the same emotional level. The pacing, while intentional, occasionally feels like it's holding the film back instead of pushing it forward. It's controlled, but sometimes too controlled. Like a director who's so focused on maintaining the mood that he hesitates to break it. And that hesitation shows up in key areas. The tension doesn't always escalate the way it should. The emotional beats don't always hit as hard as they could. The story builds, but not always with the urgency you expect. So while the direction keeps everything polished and cohesive, it doesn't always push the film into that next gear. It's the difference between a film that feels carefully crafted and one that feels truly alive. But even with those limitations, there's no denying the level of craftsmanship on display. This is a filmmaker who understands tone, who understands atmosphere, who knows how to guide performances, shape scenes, and maintain a consistent vision from beginning to end. And that's why Crime 1001 never feels careless. Even when it stumbles, it does so with intention. Even when it slows down too much, it's because the director chose that pace, not because he lost control of the film. And in a genre that often relies on excess, that kind of restraint stands out. It just comes down to this. The direction keeps Crime 101 precise, polished, and focused, but sometimes it's that same precision that prevents it from fully taking off. If there's one element that ultimately defines how you feel about Crime 101, it's the writing. Because everything else, the cast, the visuals, the tone, the direction, is working at a high level. But the script? That's where the film either holds together or starts to slip. On paper, the foundation is strong. The story is built around a compelling setup, a disciplined thief planning a final score, a detective closing in, and a web of characters whose lives intersect in meaningful ways. It's adapted from a short story, and you can feel that core idea, tight, focused, character-driven, sitting right beneath the surface. But translating that idea into a full-length screenplay is where things get complicated, because the film stretches that premise into something bigger, without always deepening it. There are moments where the writing feels sharp, dialogue that's controlled, understated, and efficient, conversations that don't over-explain, that trust the audience to read between the lines, scenes where characters speak in a way that feels natural to who they are. Professionals talking like professionals, people revealing just enough without saying everything. And in those moments, the film feels exactly like the kind of intelligent adult thriller it wants to be. But those moments aren't consistent, because for every scene that works, there's another that feels repetitive, or underdeveloped, or just slightly off. You start to notice patterns, ideas being revisited without adding anything new, conversations that circle the same emotional beats, relationships that are introduced with promise but don't fully evolve. And slowly, that sense of precision, the same precision the film builds its characters around, starts to fade. The biggest issue, though, lies in character development. The script sets up strong archetypes: the meticulous thief, the obsessed detective, the overlooked professional, the wild-card disruptor, but it doesn't always follow through on their arcs. Key changes in behavior happen without enough build-up. Emotional shifts feel abrupt instead of earned. Motivations are hinted at, but not always fully explored. So instead of watching characters evolve, you sometimes feel like you're watching them shift. And that difference matters, because in a story built on psychology and tension, the audience needs to believe in every decision. Every choice should feel like the natural result of everything that came before it, and when that chain breaks, even slightly, it pulls you out of the experience. There's also an issue of structure tied to the adaptation itself. Coming from a shorter source, the story feels expanded in ways that don't always add substance. Scenes are extended, subplots are layered in, relationships are given more time. But instead of enriching the narrative, some of these additions start to expose its thinness. You begin to see where the story is being stretched rather than deepened, and that affects the pacing, the tension, and ultimately the payoff. Then there are the moments where the writing leans on convenience, coincidences that feel too easy, plot turns that don't have enough groundwork, decisions that seem to happen because the story needs them to, not because the characters would naturally make them. These aren't constant, but they're noticeable enough to weaken the film's sense of realism, especially in a movie that's trying so hard to feel grounded. Even the dialogue, which is often one of the film's strengths, occasionally slips into something less effective. At times, it becomes a little too on the nose, or too restrained to the point where emotional clarity is lost. It's a delicate balance, saying just enough without saying too much, and the script doesn't always maintain it, and all of this builds toward the ending, because that's where the writing is truly tested. For some, the finale feels like a natural culmination, a tense, fitting conclusion to a slow-burn story. But for others, it highlights everything the script struggled with. Underdeveloped motivations, unclear emotional logic, choices that feel disconnected from the journey that led there. And that divide is the result of everything that came before it. Because when the writing works, Crime 101 feels smart, controlled, and engaging. But when it doesn't, it feels like a film that knows exactly what it wants to be, but doesn't quite have the depth to fully get there. That's the paradox of the script. It's never outright bad. In fact, it's often good. But in a film that's aiming for greatness, Good just isn't enough, and you can feel that gap in every scene where the potential is there, but not fully realized. If there's one issue that almost everyone keeps coming back to with Crime 101, it's the pacing. Not because the film is chaotic, not because it's messy, but because it moves with a kind of confidence that sometimes works against it. This is a slow burn thriller, very intentionally so. It takes its time setting up characters, relationships, and atmosphere. It lets scenes breathe. It allows silence to sit. It builds tension gradually instead of forcing it. And in the opening stretch, that approach actually works. The film pulls you in. There's momentum. There's intrigue. You're settling into the rhythm, getting a feel for the world, the players, the stakes. It feels controlled, deliberate, even refreshing in a genre that often rushes everything. But then the middle hits, and that's where the experience starts to shift. Because instead of tightening the screws, the film begins to linger. Scenes stretch just a little too long. Conversations start repeating the same emotional beats. Storylines circle back without adding new layers. And slowly, that sense of momentum begins to fade. It's not that nothing is happening. It's that not enough is progressing. And that's a crucial difference. You're still watching events unfold. Characters are still talking, moving, making decisions. But the story starts to feel like it's idling, like it's waiting to get somewhere instead of actively driving toward it. That's where the runtime becomes impossible to ignore. At over 2 hours, Crime 101 doesn't just feel long on paper, it feels long in the seat. There's a tighter, sharper version of this film hiding inside the one we got. One where certain scenes are trimmed, certain subplots are streamlined, and the overall momentum is stronger. Because right now, the middle section carries weight it doesn't need, and that weight impacts everything. The tension starts to dilute, the urgency softens, the emotional beats lose some of their impact because they're repeated instead of developed. Even the audience's engagement begins to waver. You start to feel the time instead of losing yourself in it. And that's the danger of slow burn storytelling. When it works, it's immersive. When it doesn't, it becomes exhausting. And Crime 101 lives right on that edge. There are moments in the middle where the film feels like it's building something meaningful, where the patience pays off, where the quiet tension is working. But there are just as many moments where it feels like the film is holding itself back, stretching time instead of using it. And that makes the payoff even more important, because when you ask an audience to stay with you for that long, the reward has to justify the journey. And while the film does regain some energy in its final stretch, tightening the narrative, delivering more focused tension, it doesn't completely erase the feeling that the middle section could have been stronger, sharper, and more efficient. That's the frustrating part. Because this isn't a pacing issue caused by lack of skill. It's caused by too much restraint. The film is so committed to its tone, to its slow, deliberate rhythm, that it sometimes forgets to push forward. And as a result, what should feel like tension building starts to feel like time passing. In the end, Crime 101 doesn't fail because it's slow. It struggles because it doesn't always know when to stop being slow. And in a film where precision is everything, that lack of tightness is the one thing you can't ignore. What Crime 101 is constantly chasing, more than action, more than spectacle, is tension. Not loud tension, not explosive tension, but that quiet, creeping kind, the kind that builds in the spaces between words. This is a film that believes suspense doesn't come from what's happening. It comes from what might happen, and from the very beginning, you can feel that intention. Scenes are constructed around stillness. Characters sit in rooms, exchange looks, say just enough, and then stop. The camera lingers. The music hums underneath, and there's this constant sense that something is always about to shift, even when nothing is moving on the surface. That's the slow burn approach. And when it works, it's incredibly effective, because instead of overwhelming you, the film pulls you in. It makes you lean forward. It makes you pay attention to details, to behavior, to timing, to the smallest changes in tone. You're not just watching the story, you're anticipating it. Every conversation feels like it could turn. Every interaction feels like it has weight. And that creates a different kind of engagement. You're not waiting for action, you're waiting for release. But here's where the balance becomes delicate. Because slow burn tension only works if it keeps building, if each scene adds pressure, if each moment pushes things closer to a breaking point. And that's where Crime 101 starts to divide people. For some viewers, the film absolutely delivers on that promise. The tension simmers, stretches, and finally pays off, especially as the story moves toward its final act. The last stretch tightens everything, bringing the characters together, sharpening the stakes, and delivering sequences that feel genuinely gripping. You can feel the pressure finally releasing, the quiet giving way to something more immediate, more intense, and in those moments the film clicks. You understand exactly what all that restraint was building toward. But for others, that buildup doesn't fully land. Because along the way, the tension loses consistency. There are stretches, especially in the middle, where the pressure plateaus instead of rising. Scenes hold but don't escalate. Conversations repeat instead of intensifying. And instead of feeling like a slow climb towards something inevitable, it can feel like the film is circling the same level of tension without pushing beyond it. So when the payoff arrives, it doesn't hit as hard as it should, not because the final moments are weak, but because the journey didn't tighten the screws enough. That's the risk of this kind of filmmaking. If you hold back for too long, the release has to be worth it. And Crime 1001 gets close. There are sequences, confrontations, chases, final interactions, where the film finally locks in, where the suspense feels earned, where the quiet tension transforms into something immediate and gripping. In those moments, you see the version of the film that fully works. But it doesn't sustain that level consistently enough. And that's why the experience feels uneven. Because you're constantly moving between two modes, moments where the tension is sharp, precise, and engaging, and moments where it feels like it's just being maintained instead of developed. Still, there's something admirable about how the film approaches suspense. It doesn't rely on shortcuts. It doesn't flood the screen with distractions. It trusts its characters, its atmosphere, its control. And even when it falters, that approach gives the film a distinct identity. This isn't a thriller that shouts, it whispers. And whether those whispers pull you in or leave you waiting for more depends entirely on how much patience you bring with you. Because Crime 21 isn't trying to overwhelm you with tension. It's trying to make you sit with it until it finally breaks. If you walk into Crime 101 expecting non-stop action, you're going to be surprised. Because this isn't that kind of crime movie. There are no constant shootouts, no endless explosions, no wall-to-wall spectacle designed to keep your adrenaline spiking every 5 minutes. Instead, the film takes a very different approach. It withholds, and that makes every piece of action feel like a release. Because when Crime 101 finally decides to move, when it shifts from quiet tension into motion, it doesn't waste the moment. The action here is selective, but it's sharp. Take the car chases, for example. These aren't just loud sequences thrown in to wake the audience up. They're tightly constructed, grounded, and purposeful. The camera placement, the movement, the way the vehicles interact with the environment, it all feels controlled. You're not watching chaos, you're watching precision under pressure. And that's what makes them work. They don't rely on excess. They rely on tension. You feel the weight of every turn, every acceleration, every decision being made in real time. There's a sense of danger that comes not from spectacle but from realism. It's not about how big the scene is, it's about how tight it feels. And when those sequences hit, they genuinely elevate the film. They remind you what all that buildup was leading toward. But here's the key thing. There just isn't a lot of them. And that's where the divide starts. For some viewers, that restraint is exactly what makes the action effective. Because the film doesn't overuse it, each set piece carries more impact. It feels earned. It feels like a payoff to the tension that's been building underneath the surface. But for others, it feels like something is missing. Because when you have a premise built around heists, pursuit, and high-stakes crime, you expect a certain level of energy. You expect more movement, more escalation, more moments where the film lets loose. And Crime 1001 never fully becomes that kind of movie. Even the heists themselves, the core of the story, are handled in a way that prioritizes mood over mechanics. You don't always get the intricate, step-by-step breakdowns or the elaborate execution that some viewers look for in this genre. Instead, the film focuses on the feeling of the moment rather than the process behind it. That choice works for the tone, but it can leave some people wanting more substance, more detail, more complexity, more payoff. Still, when the film does commit to a set piece, whether it's a chase, a confrontation, or a moment where all the characters finally collide, it shows what it's capable of. The direction tightens, the pacing sharpens, and the tension that's been simmering finally finds an outlet. And in those moments, Crime 101 feels alive. You can see the version of the film where everything clicks, where the restraint, the build-up, and the payoff all align perfectly. But because those moments are spaced out, they don't fully define the experience. Instead, they become highlights. Peaks in a film that spends most of its time in a controlled, measured state. So the effectiveness of the action really comes down to expectation. If you're looking for a thriller where every 10 minutes delivers a new set piece, this won't satisfy you. But if you're willing to sit through the quiet, to let the tension build, and to accept that the film is saving its energy for specific moments, then when those moments arrive, they hit harder. Not because there's more of them, but because the film made you wait for them. If there's one area where Crime 101 almost feels untouchable, it's how it looks. This is a film that understands the power of image. From the very first frame, there's a clear visual identity. Sleek, controlled, deliberate. Nothing feels accidental. Every shot feels composed, like it's been carefully placed to serve the tone the film is chasing. And that tone is everything. Because Crime 101 isn't just telling a story, it's creating an atmosphere you can sink into. The cinematography leans into contrast. Bright, sun-soaked exteriors that feel almost too clean, paired with moody, shadow-heavy interiors that carry tension in every corner. There's a constant push and pull between beauty and danger, between surfaces that look polished and the unease that sits underneath them. And nowhere is that more effective than in how the film uses Los Angeles. This isn't a generic backdrop. The city feels alive. You move through highways, neighborhoods, glass towers, quiet streets, coastal spaces, and each location adds something different to the story. There's a sense of scale, but also intimacy. You feel how vast the city is, and at the same time, how small and exposed the characters are within it. Los Angeles becomes more than a setting. It becomes a reflection of the characters' lives, polished on the outside, complicated underneath. There's a seductive quality to it. The way the light hits certain scenes, the way the camera glides through environments, the way the city seems to invite you in, only to remind you that there's danger lurking just beneath the surface. It's beautiful, but never safe. And that duality matters, because the film itself lives in that same space, controlled, stylish, but always carrying tension. Technically, the filmmaking supports this perfectly. The camera work is precise. You notice it in the smaller details. The way it's mounted during driving sequences, the way it holds on a character just long enough, the way it frames conversations to emphasize distance or connection. Even the transitions between scenes feel smooth, almost effortless, like the film is guiding you through this world without ever breaking immersion. There are moments where the camera placement alone adds meaning. You're not just watching characters interact. You're watching how the space around them shapes those interactions. Who feels in control? Who feels isolated? Who feels trapped? And that's the mark of strong visual storytelling. But beyond the technical side, what really stands out is the texture. This film feels a certain way. There's a coolness to it, a polished surface. But underneath that, there's a grit, something slightly off, slightly tense, slightly uncomfortable. It's not flashy in an overwhelming way. It's controlled, confident, almost understated. And that consistency is key. Because even when other elements of the film start to falter, whether it's pacing, writing, or narrative momentum, the visuals never drop. They keep you engaged, they keep you immersed, they keep reminding you of the film's identity. In some ways, the cinematography is doing what the story sometimes struggles to do, maintaining a constant sense of atmosphere and intention from beginning to end. And that's why it becomes one of the film's strongest assets. Because even if you're not fully invested in what's happening, you're still drawn into how it looks. You're still moving through that world. You're still feeling that tension in the frame. And in a film like Crime 21, where mood and tone are everything, that visual control goes a long way. If the visuals give Crime 101 its style, the music gives it its pulse. Because this is a film where the score isn't just background noise, it's the atmosphere. From the very beginning, you can feel how much the film relies on its sound to shape the experience. The music doesn't come in to announce itself. It seeps in, subtle at first, controlled, almost invisible, but always there, sitting just beneath the surface, guiding how you feel about every moment. And that's what makes it so effective. This isn't a loud, overpowering soundtrack trying to force emotion. It's restrained, measured. It understands the tone of the film, cool, deliberate, slightly detached, and it builds around that. You get these moody, synth-driven textures that create a constant undercurrent of tension, even in scenes where nothing is actively happening. So even when the characters are just talking, you feel something brewing. That's the role the score plays. It fills the silence without breaking it. It keeps the tension alive when the pacing slows down. It turns quiet moments into something charged, and in a film that leans so heavily on slow-burn storytelling, that becomes essential. Because without that musical layer, some of those extended scenes might feel empty. With it, they feel intentional. There's also a sense of identity in the soundtrack. It taps into that classic crime thriller mood, that slightly nostalgic, late-night neon-soaked energy, while still feeling modern. It doesn't try to reinvent anything. It refines, it polishes, it reinforces the world the film is building visually. And when it lines up with the cinematography, that's when Crime 101 feels at its strongest. You get these moments where the image, the pacing, and the music all lock together. And suddenly, the film has a rhythm, a flow, a kind of quiet momentum that pulls you in without you even realizing it. But just like everything else in this film, the music also highlights its weaknesses, because in some scenes, the score feels like it's doing more work than it should. There are moments where the tension is coming more from the music than from the writing or the situation itself, where the soundtrack is trying to elevate a scene that doesn't quite have enough weight on its own. And while it often succeeds in making those moments feel more engaging, you can still sense that imbalance. It's like the film is leaning on the music to maintain its energy. And when that happens, you start to notice it. Still, that doesn't take away from how well crafted the overall sound design is. There are tracks that hit at exactly the right time, moments where the music rises just enough to push a scene forward, moments where it fades out and lets silence take over, making the tension feel even sharper. And then there are those standout musical choices, the kind that stick with you after the scene ends, the kind that give the film a personality beyond its visuals. Because that's what the soundtrack ultimately does. It gives Crime 101 a voice, not a loud one, not an aggressive one, but a steady, controlled presence that runs through the entire film. And even if the story doesn't always hold together, that musical atmosphere does. It keeps the film moving. It keeps the tension alive. And it reminds you constantly that beneath all the calm, there's something waiting to break. If direction is about control, then editing is about precision. And in Crime 1001, you can feel that precision, but you can also feel where it starts to slip. Because this is a film that wants to be tight. It wants to move smoothly between characters, between timelines, between emotional beats, and for the most part, it succeeds. The transitions are clean. The shifts between storylines are fluid. You're never confused about where you are or who you're following. The film glides from one perspective to another with a kind of quiet confidence, and that's not easy, especially in a story built on intersecting narratives. When the editing is working, it gives the film a rhythm, a sense of flow. One storyline builds tension, then hands it off to another. One scene sets something up, another pays it off later. It feels like a system, carefully arranged, constantly moving, always guiding you forward. But here's the problem. That flow doesn't always translate into tightness. Because even though the film moves smoothly, it doesn't always move efficiently. There are scenes that linger longer than they need to, conversations that could have been trimmed, moments where the pacing slows not because the story demands it, but because the edit doesn't push things forward. And over time, those extra seconds start to add up. You begin to feel the length. You begin to notice the repetition. You begin to sense that the film isn't as sharp as it could be. And that's where the editing becomes a missed opportunity. Because this is a movie that needed a tighter cut. Not a complete overhaul. The structure itself is solid, but a refinement, a trimming of excess, a sharpening of transitions between emotional beats. A more aggressive approach to keeping the momentum alive, especially in the middle section where the film starts to drift. There are even moments where the editing draws attention to itself in the wrong way. Quick cuts in dialogue scenes that feel slightly jarring. Transitions that, while smooth, don't always carry enough weight to maintain tension. And occasionally, sequences that feel like they end a beat too late or start a beat too early. These aren't constant issues. But in a film that relies so heavily on control and rhythm, even small inconsistencies stand out. Because editing isn't just about cutting scenes together. It's about shaping how the audience feels time. And in Crime 1001, time is something you become very aware of. That doesn't mean the editing fails, far from it. There are stretches where it works beautifully, where the film flows effortlessly, where the transitions enhance the storytelling, where the pacing feels intentional and immersive. You can see the craftsmanship, you can see the thought behind how everything is assembled, but you can also see where it could have been sharper, where it could have elevated the film from well-made to exceptional. Because in a story built on precision, on characters who live by timing, by calculation, by control, the edit should reflect that same philosophy. Every cut should feel necessary, every transition should feel purposeful. Every moment should push the story forward. And while Crime 101 gets close to that ideal, it never fully locks into it. It's smooth, it's polished, but it's not as tight as it needs to be. And in a film where pacing is already a challenge, that lack of structural sharpness becomes impossible to ignore. Beneath the heists, the chases, and the polished surface of Crime 101, there's a deeper layer the film keeps returning to. And that layer is about people trying to hold on to control in a world that's slowly taking it away from them. Because this isn't just a story about crime, it's a story about why people cross lines in the first place. Take class, for example. Money isn't just a goal here, it's a dividing line. You see how it shapes environments, relationships, and even self-worth. Some characters operate comfortably within wealth, others orbit it, chasing access, recognition, or escape. And that imbalance quietly fuels decisions. It's not always spoken out loud, but it's always there, influencing how people move, what they risk, and what they're willing to justify. Then there's the idea of professional codes. Almost every major character in this film lives by a set of rules. The thief has his discipline. The detective has his instincts. Others have their own boundaries, lines they believe they won't cross. But the film keeps asking a simple question. What happens when those codes stop working? What happens when the system you built to protect yourself starts to break? Because that's when things get interesting. That's when control starts to slip. And underneath all of that, there's loneliness, a quiet, persistent loneliness that runs through almost every character. These are people who are good at what they do, maybe too good. Their lives have become so structured around their roles that there's very little space left for anything else. Relationships feel strained, connections feel fragile, and even when they reach for something more, something personal, it comes with risk. Because stepping outside the system means losing the one thing that kept them stable. Then you have career frustration. Characters who have put in the years, done the work, followed the rules, and still find themselves overlooked, passed over, replaced. That kind of frustration doesn't explode immediately. It builds. It sits there, quietly, shaping how they see themselves and the world around them. And eventually, it leads to choices. Choices that might not have made sense before. Choices that feel justified in the moment. Which brings us to aging. There's a subtle but important thread running through the film about time. About what happens when you're no longer at your peak, when the world starts moving past you, when experience isn't valued the way it once was. You see it in the way characters are treated, in the way they carry themselves, in the way they react to being sidelined. And that ties directly into morality. Because Crime 101 doesn't deal in clean moral lines, it blurs them. The thief has a code, so we're tempted to sympathize with him. The detective is chasing justice, but he's driven by obsession. Others make questionable decisions, but those decisions are rooted in understandable emotions: frustration, ambition, desperation, the need to feel seen. So the film keeps pushing you into this uncomfortable space where you start to understand everyone. Not necessarily agree with them, but understand them. And that's where the tension really comes from. Not just what will happen, but who do you side with? Because the more you learn about these characters, the harder that question becomes. Everyone is operating within their own logic, everyone believes they're justified, and everyone, in their own way, is crossing a line. That's what gives Crime 101 its thematic weight. It's not just about crime as an act, it's about crime as a response to pressure, to neglect, to ambition, to time running out. And when you look at it that way, the film stops being a story about good versus bad, and becomes a story about people, trying to hold on to their place in a world that's quietly slipping out of their control. For a film that leans so heavily on precision, professionalism, and control, Crime 1001 constantly walks a fine line when it comes to realism. Because this is a movie that wants to feel grounded. It presents itself as a smart, adult crime thriller the kind where every move matters, every decision has weight, and every detail feels thought through. You're meant to believe in the world, believe in the process, believe that what you're watching could actually happen. And in some moments, that illusion works. The film is juggling a lot. Multiple storylines, multiple characters, multiple themes. And while that ambition is admirable, it doesn't always manage to balance everything effectively. Some threads get too much time, others don't get enough. Some ideas are explored, others are left hanging. It creates this uneven experience where parts of the film feel complete and others feel unfinished. And that's the key word here, unfinished, not in execution, but in development. Because Crime 21 isn't lacking ideas, it's lacking follow-through. It sets things up, but doesn't always deliver. It introduces depth, but doesn't always explore it. It hints at complexity, but doesn't always commit to it. And that's why the weaknesses stand out so much. Because the film gets so close to being something more, you can see the potential in every unresolved thread, in every underused character, in every moment where the story almost deepens but stops just short. And that's what makes it frustrating. Not that it fails completely, but that it never fully becomes what it could have been. So the real question is, who is Crime 21 actually for? Because this is one of those films where your experience is going to depend almost entirely on what you expect going in. If you're walking in thinking this is a fast-paced, action-heavy heist movie, something loud, explosive, constantly moving, you're going to feel the weight of it. You're going to notice the slower pace, the long scenes, the limited action, and probably walk out thinking the film never really delivered the thrill it promised. But if you come in with a different mindset, if you're looking for a more controlled, character-driven crime story, something that leans into atmosphere, tension, and performance rather than spectacle, then Crime 101 has a lot more to offer. Because this is a film that's built for patience. It's built for viewers who are willing to sit with the characters, to absorb the mood, to let the tension build slowly instead of expecting immediate payoff. It's not trying to entertain you every second, it's trying to pull you into a world and let you live in it for a while. And for the right audience, that works. This is the kind of movie that crime thriller fans, especially those who appreciate slower, more deliberate storytelling, will likely enjoy. People who like watching professionals operate. People who enjoy moral ambiguity, subtle performances, and stories that don't spell everything out. There's a level of craft here that's easy to appreciate if that's what you're looking for. The performances are strong, the visuals are polished, the atmosphere is consistent. And even when the film stumbles, it rarely feels careless. But at the same time, this isn't a film that demands to be seen in theaters for everyone. For some viewers, this is going to feel like a good, but not great experience. Something you enjoy, but don't necessarily need to rush out for. The kind of movie that might actually play just as well, if not better, in a more relaxed setting. Because while it's engaging, it's not always gripping. While it's stylish, it's not always memorable. And while it has all the pieces of something special, it doesn't fully come together in a way that makes it essential viewing, so the recommendation becomes very specific. If you love slow-burn crime thrillers, if you enjoy character-driven stories with strong performances, if you're okay with a film that prioritizes mood over momentum, then Crime 101 is absolutely worth your time. But if you're looking for something fast, explosive, and tightly packed with action and twists, you might walk away disappointed. And that's the key to this film. It's not about whether it's good or bad, it's about whether it's your kind of movie. Because Crime 101 doesn't try to be everything for everyone. It knows exactly what it wants to be. The question is, do you want that too?